There is a stretch of borderland between Bolivia and Peru that is 120 kilometers long, sits at an altitude that would make most people's lungs seize up, runs along the edge of one of the most remote bodies of water in the Americas, and has not been entered by a single government official from either nation in at least 14 years. Not patrolled, not inspected, not administered, not visited. 14 years of state absence from a strip of land that is technically claimed, theoretically governed, bureaucratically assigned to two separate nations, with two separate flags, and two separate sets of laws, and two separate presidents, who have both, in their own way, simply left this place alone. And the place, in response, has done something that places always do when the state withdraws. It has developed its own logic, its own rules, its own life, completely outside the framework that the two governments on either side of it have constructed for everyone else. And the thing that makes this not just a political curiosity, but something genuinely staggering, is what is happening inside that 120 kilometers. Who is living there? What they are doing? What they have built, not with government permission or government resources, but with the particular intelligence that emerges when people are left entirely to themselves on the roof of the world, with no safety net, and no oversight, and nothing but each other, and the lake and the mountains, and an economy that the formal world either does not know about or has decided it would rather not see. Subscribe right now if you want to understand the parts of this planet that official maps get completely wrong. Not wrong in their geography, but wrong in what they tell you about how people actually live. Let's go. The first thing you need to understand about this borderland is the altitude, because the altitude explains almost everything else. The Bolivia-Peru border in this specific region runs along the southern and southeastern shore of Lake Titicaca, and Lake Titicaca sits at 3,812 meters above sea level, nearly 4 kilometers up. The air at that altitude contains roughly 60% of the oxygen available at sea level. New arrivals, tourists who fly into Cusco or Puno or La Paz and immediately try to walk up a flight of stairs, will tell you about the headaches that come on like a hammer to the skull, the nausea, the dizziness, the strange breathless exhaustion that overtakes you doing the most basic physical tasks, the altitude sickness that locals call soroche, and that can, in serious cases, escalate into pulmonary or cerebral edema that will kill you if you do not descend. And yet people have been living at this altitude, around this lake, on these shores, for somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 years. Not visiting, not passing through, living, farming at altitudes where farming should arguably be impossible, fishing in a lake so cold and so high that the biology of it is unlike any other lake on the continent. Building communities, developing technologies, creating civilizations that peaked and declined, and were absorbed and recreated on these shores across millennia before the Spanish arrived and tried to reorganize everything according to a completely different set of assumptions about what land was for and who it belonged to and how it should be governed. The Aymara-speaking communities that today populate the shores of Lake Titicaca on both the Bolivian and Peruvian sides of the border are the inheritors of that long continuity. They are not recent arrivals. They are not a population that settled here in historical memory. They are the people of this lake in a way that goes back further than the Inca, further than the Tiwanaku civilization, whose ruins sit on the Bolivian side of the lake, and whose stone temples and monolithic statues represent one of the great pre-Columbian civilizations of the Americas. The relationship between the Aymara and Lake Titicaca is not a relationship of 500 years or 1,000 years. It is measured in millennia, and that depth of relationship is part of what makes the 120-kilometer borderland so strange and so significant, because the border itself is only about 100 years old in its current form, which means that from the perspective of the communities who live along it, the border is the novelty. They are not the novelty. The border is the recent intrusion. They are the ancient fact. Now let us talk about the border itself, and why it has been left unattended for so long, because the explanation is not simple, and it is not a single thing. It is a convergence of geography and politics and economics and demographics that produced a situation that both governments have found it easier to ignore than to address. The terrain along the southern shore of Titicaca, in this specific stretch, is difficult. Not impassable, but genuinely difficult. The lake shore is irregular, cut by inlets and peninsulas, backed by altiplano terrain that is flat, in a way that sounds simple but is deceptive, because the flatness of the altiplano is wind-scoured and frost-bitten, and crossed by rivers that have no bridges in many places, and the roads that exist are often tracks that become impassable for weeks at a time in the rainy season when the ground saturates and vehicles sink, and even experienced local drivers turn back. The infrastructure investment required to maintain a meaningful government presence along this stretch would be substantial, and the populations involved, scattered across small communities of a few hundred people each, dispersed across a landscape that resists centralization, do not represent a political constituency that either government has found it urgent to serve. The Bolivian National Police, which is responsible for border security in its territory, has staffing levels in the Altiplano departments that have been consistently inadequate for decades. The nearest permanent police post to the central stretch of this unvisited borderland is in a town that is itself several hours away by the roads that exist. Peruvian border officials are similarly constrained. The resources that both nations direct toward their mutual border are concentrated at the crossing points, the official places where traffic is heavy and where the state can see and process and tax and document what is moving. The 120-kilometer stretch between those official crossings is, in the cost-benefit calculation of both governments, simply not worth the expense of sustained attention. And so it has been left. And what has happened in the leaving is something that official maps cannot show you and official reports do not contain. To understand what life looks like in this borderland, you have to understand the economy that has grown up along Lake Titicaca's southern shore in the absence of formal governance, and that economy is built around movement. Specifically around the movement of goods across a border that exists on paper but does not exist on the ground. The communities of the borderland are not smugglers in the way that word conjures images of organized crime and violence and calculated law-breaking. They are traders in the way that people have always been traders, in places where two different economic systems exist side by side, and the gap between them creates opportunity. Bolivia has cheaper fuel. Peru has different agricultural goods. Bolivia has subsidized cooking gas that can be purchased at prices far below what it costs across the border. Peru has foodstuffs and manufactured goods that Bolivia does not produce or distributes unevenly. And in the borderland, where the line between the two economies is not a fence or a wall or a customs post, but simply a point on a map that neither government is enforcing, the price differentials flow like water through a crack. Families in the borderland have built their lives around this flow. Men and women who wake before dawn and load their vehicles or their animals with goods purchased on one side, cross the invisible line during the day, sell what they have brought, buy what is cheaper on the other side, and return in the evening, not once or twice, but every day. This is not a side activity. It is the primary economic activity of entire communities. The borderland economy is fundamentally a cross-border economy, and the absence of government oversight is not an inconvenience to it, but a precondition of it. The moment the border is staffed and enforced, the price differentials that make this trade possible narrow or disappear, because the goods that move must now pay duties that wipe out the margin. The unattended border is not a failure of governance from the perspective of the people who live along it. It is the economic environment they depend on. But the economy of the borderland is not only about moving goods across an invisible line. It is also about the lake itself, and the relationship between these communities and the water is ancient and intricate, and completely outside any regulatory framework that either the Bolivian or Peruvian fisheries authorities have ever been able to meaningfully enforce in this stretch. Lake Titicaca is the highest commercially navigable lake in the world, and it is a freshwater ecosystem of enormous biological significance. It is home to species that exist nowhere else on Earth, fish that evolved in this cold, high-altitude water over thousands of years and adapted to its specific chemistry and temperature and depth, as well as the totora reeds that grow along its shallower margins and that have been the material basis of Andean lakeshore civilization for longer than writing has existed in this part of the world. The communities of the borderland fish the lake with techniques that are partly ancient and partly modern, using gill nets and traps, and in some places still the ancient totora reed boats called balsas, that are among the most recognizable images in Andean iconography. Boats made from bundled reeds that are waterproof by the physics of their material and that can navigate the lake with a lightness and responsiveness that no rigid hull boat matches in the shallow nearshore waters. The fishing of the borderland is also cross-border in a fundamental way. The fish do not know about the boundary. They move through the water in patterns that correspond to their own biology, following food and temperature and depth, and the fishermen follow the fish, which means that on any given day, a Bolivian family might be fishing what is technically Peruvian water, and a Peruvian family might be in what is technically Bolivian water, and in the absence of any Coast Guard or fisheries official to enforce the distinction, Nobody particularly cares. The fishermen know each other. They have known each other for generations. They are in many cases related by blood, because the communities on both sides of this border have been intermarrying for centuries without much regard for where a line on a map falls, and the cousins and uncles and in-laws on the other side of the lake are not foreigners in any sense that these communities recognize. This is one of the most important things to understand about this borderland and about borderlands in general. The border is a state construct. The community predates the state. The families who live along this 120-kilometer stretch are not citizens of Bolivia or citizens of Peru in any primary sense. They are people of the lake. They are Aymara in a way that the borders of Bolivia and Peru are not Aymara. The categories of the nation-state sit on top of a much older set of categories: family and community and lake and mountain, and in the borderland where the nation-state has withdrawn, those older categories reassert themselves completely. The Aymara language, which is spoken by somewhere between 2 and 3 million people across Bolivia, Peru, and Chile, is one of the most structurally unusual languages in the world. Linguists who study it note features that have no parallel in most other languages, including a temporal system in which the past is considered to be in front of you, because it is what you can see, it is known, it is visible to your memory, and the future is behind you, because you cannot see it, it has not happened yet, it is at your back. This is not simply a metaphorical quirk, it is built into the grammar of the language, into the spatial terms and the directional markers and the tense system. To be a speaker of Aymara is to inhabit a fundamentally different orientation to time than a speaker of Spanish or English. And in the borderland, where Spanish is a second language and Aymara is the first language of daily life, that orientation is not a historical artifact. It is the living framework through which people understand their own situation. Think about what it means to live in a place where time works this way, where the known past is in front of you and the unknown future is at your back. The ancestors are not behind these communities, fading into an increasingly distant historical past. The ancestors are in front of them, visible, present. The lake as it was, the community as it was, the ways of doing things as they were, all of that is the visible territory, the known territory, the territory in front of your eyes. And the government officials who have not come in 14 years, the border enforcement that may or may not arrive someday, the future that the state might impose, all of that is behind you, unseen, approaching from a direction you cannot look at directly. You know it is there, but it is not what you are looking at. Now let us talk about what the physical landscape of this specific stretch actually looks like, because it is important, and it is extraordinary, and it does not match most people's image of what a border looks like. The southern shore of Lake Titicaca, in the borderland zone, is not a hard shoreline. It is porous. The totora reed beds that grow in the shallower water extend outward from the shore in dense, tall stands, sometimes hundreds of meters into the lake, and they blur the distinction between water and land in a way that makes the idea of a fixed borderline almost absurd. When the wind blows in from the water, the reeds move in waves that look like green water, and from a boat you cannot always tell where navigable water ends and reed bed begins. From the shore, looking out through the reeds, you cannot always tell where the shore ends. Everything is in between. Everything is threshold. The reed beds are not waste ground. They are agricultural land of a very specific kind, managed and harvested and replanted across generations, in ways that maintain their productivity. The totora reeds have been used by lakeshore communities for everything, as building material for the boats, as thatching for roofs, as fodder for the cattle and sheep that graze the altiplano margin, as food, because the young white shoots at the base of the reed are edible and nutritious and have been eaten by these communities for as long as memory extends, as raw material for the floating islands that the most famous lake communities, the Uros people of the Peruvian side, construct and inhabit in the middle of the lake itself. The reeds are simultaneously shelter and boat and food and field, and the knowledge of how to manage them, how to cut without killing, how to encourage regrowth, how to read the health of a reed bed from the color and density of its growth, is one of the fundamental bodies of knowledge that the communities of the borderland carry. The altiplano behind the shore is another kind of extraordinary. At nearly 4,000 meters, the vegetation of the altiplano is compressed, low and tough, and adapted to the cold and the wind and the intense ultraviolet radiation of thin air at altitude. The ichu grass that covers most of the plateau is coarse and golden, and moves in the wind in a way that can make vast stretches of it look like a slow-moving sea. The sky above the Altiplano is enormous, because there is nothing tall to interrupt it except the mountains on the horizon, and the mountains in this region are the Andes in their most dramatic form, with volcanic peaks that reach above 5 and 6,000 meters carrying permanent snow, visible from the lakeshore on clear days as white points above the golden grass, impossibly high. The light on the Altiplano is unlike light anywhere at lower elevation. The ultraviolet intensity that comes with thin air at altitude means that colors are sharper, contrasts are more stark, shadows are harder edged. The blue of the lake is a color that does not exist at sea level, a deep, concentrated blue that looks almost artificial, like someone supersaturated the color in a photograph. The blue comes from the altitude and the clarity of the water and the angle of light that hits it at this latitude and this elevation, and when you see it for the first time, particularly if you come from a lower, softer landscape, it is one of those colors that the visual cortex initially rejects as too intense to be natural. But it is natural. It is the lake. It is just the lake. The sunsets on the Altiplano around Lake Titicaca are events that people who have witnessed them do not easily forget. The low angle of light at this latitude, the thin air, the reflective surface of the lake, the snow on distant volcanic peaks, all of these combine in the late afternoon to produce a color show that moves through shades of orange and pink and purple and deep red in a way that seems to change every minute, the lake surface picking up each shift in the sky above it and amplifying it so that you are surrounded by the color, above and below and reflected in the water all around. And in the borderland, where there is no electric light for miles, where the darkness when it comes is true darkness, and the stars when they appear are the altitude stars, brilliant and numerous in a way that lower elevations never produce. The transition from that sunset into that darkness is a daily event of physical grandeur that the communities here have witnessed for every day of their lives, and that most of the world has no idea exists. But let us go deeper into the specific communities of the 120-kilometer stretch, because the landscape, as extraordinary as it is a frame. The people are the content. There are perhaps a dozen significant communities distributed across this stretch, ranging from villages of a few hundred people to smaller settlements of extended family groups that might not number more than 40 or 50 individuals in total. None of these communities is on a tourist map. None is mentioned in the Lonely Planet Guide to Bolivia or Peru. None has a hotel or a hostel or a restaurant oriented toward outsiders. The infrastructure of each community is oriented entirely inward, toward its own needs and toward the cross-border economic activity that sustains it. And the idea that someone from outside might arrive wanting something, wanting to photograph or to study or to understand, is an idea these communities have learned to treat with a certain careful neutrality that is not unfriendliness, but is not openness either. It is the neutrality of people who have learned that outsiders, including government officials, rarely arrive with anything that turns out to be good for the community. The houses of the borderland communities are built from adobe, the sun-dried mud brick that is the primary building material of the Altiplano from ancient times to the present. Adobe is extraordinarily well suited to this climate. The thick mud walls have a thermal mass that stabilizes interior temperature against the dramatic swings that the Altiplano produces, where a day that reaches 15 or even 20 degrees Celsius at midday in the dry season can fall below freezing before midnight. The mud absorbs heat during the day and releases it slowly through the night, making the interior of a well-built adobe house warmer than a thin-walled structure would be, and cooler at midday than the exposed outside. The building technique is one of those bodies of knowledge, like the carving of volcanic rock in Candovan or the water management of the Iranian desert, that looks simple from the outside and is anything but. The ratio of clay to sand in the mix, the drying time before the block can be laid, the thickness of the wall at different heights, the way corners are reinforced, the construction of a roof that will not collapse under the weight of snow in the dry season's late surprises. Each of these is knowledge, accumulated across generations, passed through demonstration and practice rather than textbooks. The roofs of borderland houses are typically made of corrugated metal sheeting over a wooden frame, which represents a modern material layered onto an ancient form. The corrugated iron is a 20th century addition to Altiplano construction, replacing the earlier thatched totora roofs and the heavier clay tile roofs that required more complex structural support. The iron is lighter and longer lasting and requires less maintenance than thatch, but it is thermally terrible compared to both, conducting heat in and cold in with equal efficiency, which is why the combination of iron roof and adobe walls is so common. You get the durability of the iron and the thermal mass of the adobe doing the work that the iron cannot do. The interiors of the houses are small by middle-class Western standards and large by the standards of what is needed. A main room for eating and family life, a sleeping area, often a separate kitchen with its own stove, because the cooking fire is also a heat source and needs to be managed separately from the living space. The walls inside are sometimes whitewashed, sometimes left as raw adobe. There are religious images, almost universally. The Catholic saints that arrived with the Spanish syncretized over 500 years with indigenous spiritual practices into a form of Andean Catholicism that is technically Catholic and practically something more complex. Where the saints are interchangeable with the mountain spirits called Apis, and where offerings to Pachamama, the Earth Mother, are as routine as attendance at Sunday Mass, and the two practices coexist without contradiction in the minds of people who hold both as simply true. The religious life of the borderland communities is a living museum of syncretism. The fiestas that punctuate the calendar are organized around the Catholic feast days, but their content is Andean in ways that would have alarmed the Spanish missionaries who first introduced the Christian calendar here, and that continue to sit uncomfortably with the formal Catholic hierarchy, which has made periodic efforts over the centuries to suppress the indigenous elements of these celebrations without ever fully succeeding. The music of the fiestas is played on instruments that are themselves a syncretic combination. The Spanish guitar that arrived in the 16th century now played in styles and tunings that are indigenous. The pre-Columbian wind instruments like the siku panpipes and the quena flute that are thousands of years old and that sound, to ears accustomed to Western musical scales, like something coming from an entirely different tonal universe. The siku deserves a moment, because it is one of those instruments that does not fully translate into words, but that, if you have ever heard it played well in the open air of the Altiplano with the wind off the lake, you will not forget. It is a panpipe but played in a specific Andean way that is called hocketing, where two players interlock their playing, each one playing alternating notes of the melody, so that the complete musical line can only be produced by two instruments and two players together. One siku cannot play the full melody. It takes two, playing off each other in a conversation that is both musical and social, where the music itself is the relationship between the players rather than the output of a single musician. It is a form of music that encodes community into its basic structure. A siku needs a partner. You cannot play alone. In the borderland communities, the siku tradition is not performed for tourists. There are no tourists. It is played at the fiestas and the family celebrations and the agricultural ceremonies and the funerals, in its proper context, as part of the rhythm of community life that has been unfolding in these places for longer than the borders that are supposed to define them have existed. Now let us talk about the children of the borderland, because the children are where the future of these communities is being determined, and the situation they are in is complicated in ways that have no easy resolution. Education in the borderland is the clearest example of the state's incomplete presence. Bolivia and Peru both have school systems that theoretically extend to rural communities, and there are schools in the borderland, small buildings staffed by teachers who are often assigned to rural posts as a condition of their training, young people from the cities who come to the Altiplano for a year or two and then leave, rotating through in a way that provides basic literacy and numeracy, but very little in terms of continuity or depth. The teachers who stay, who genuinely connect with the communities and learn enough Aymara to communicate properly with the younger children, who arrive at school already fluent in Aymara and learning Spanish as a second language, these teachers are the exception. They are remembered by the communities for decades. The ones who leave are forgotten quickly, which is its own kind of assessment of what they provided. The formal curriculum that both Bolivian and Peruvian rural schools are supposed to follow is designed for a generic national student, a child who will grow up to participate in the formal economy of the nation, who will need the skills appropriate to that participation. The curriculum does not include knowledge of how to manage a totora reed bed, or navigate the borderland economy, or read the weather patterns of the Altiplano from the look of the sky over the Cordillera Real, or any of the other specific knowledge that actually determines whether a family in this borderland will survive and thrive. That knowledge is transmitted at home, in the fields and on the lake, through the same process of demonstration and practice that has always transmitted it. The school teaches Spanish, and arithmetic, and national history, and the formal curriculum. The family teaches everything else, and the children are navigating both. What this produces, in the borderland, is a generation that is genuinely bilingual and bicultural, in a very specific way. They can move between the formal world, when it occasionally appears, and the informal world that they actually inhabit, with a fluency that neither world has given them credit for. They know how to present themselves to an outsider, to a researcher, or an official, or a stranger, in terms that the outsider's framework can accommodate, and they know how to be themselves when the outsider is gone. This is not deception. It is the practical intelligence of people who occupy a border zone in every sense of the word, between two nations, between formal and informal economies, between Spanish and Aymara, between the world as their grandparents knew it, and whatever the world is becoming. The oldest people in the borderland communities are another kind of archive. They remember things that no written record contains and that no official report has ever captured, because the officials who might have captured it were not there. They remember how the borderland worked in the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s, the specific goods that moved across the invisible line in each decade, the particular price differentials that drove different kinds of trade, the people who became wealthy in relative terms by mastering the geography of the border economy, and the people who were ruined by it, the years when the rain came wrong and the crops failed and what the community did, the specific stories of how families managed the cross-border relationships that sustained them, who married whom, from which side of the line, and what that meant for which resources a family could access. They remember what the lake was like. This is perhaps the most significant thing they carry, and it is not a comfortable memory. The lake has changed in their lifetimes, in ways that are visible and measurable and distressing to people who have known it across many decades. The Totora reed beds have contracted in some areas and expanded in others, in patterns that do not entirely make sense to the people who have managed them for generations. The fish populations have shifted. The species that were common when these elders were children are less common now, and species that were unusual are more common, reflecting changes in the lake's chemistry and temperature and the impact of introduced fish, like rainbow trout, that were brought to the lake in the 20th century as a commercial fishery species and that have altered the ecosystem in ways that are still working themselves out. The water level of Lake Titicaca itself fluctuates with the climate cycles of the Altiplano, and the oldest people in the borderland remember both the high water years when the lake encroached on land that is now dry, and the low water years when islands appeared that are normally submerged. This long memory of the lake's behavior across climate cycles is itself a form of knowledge that no instrumental record fully captures, because the instrumental records are short and incomplete and do not go back to living memory. The elders are the instrument. Their memory is the record. And when they are gone, that record is gone with them. The health situation in the borderland is another dimension that the state's absence has shaped in ways both expected and unexpected. The expected: access to formal medical care is extremely limited. The nearest hospitals are in the regional cities, hours away by the roads that exist. The government health posts that are supposed to serve rural Altiplano communities are, in the borderland, often unstaffed or sporadically staffed, lacking basic supplies, visited by traveling health workers on schedules that are theoretical rather than reliable. The diseases that can be treated easily in a city with functioning healthcare infrastructure, the infections and complications and chronic conditions that respond well to timely medical attention, are managed in the borderland through a combination of traditional medicine, self-treatment, and the occasional visit to a town clinic when something gets serious enough to justify the journey. The unexpected: the traditional medical knowledge of Aymara communities in the Altiplano is not primitive in the sense that word is often used. It is sophisticated and empirically grounded, and has been developed over millennia in a specific environment with specific plants and specific diseases. The medicinal plants of the Altiplano have been cataloged by ethnobotanists in recent decades, and many of them have demonstrated pharmacological activity that validates the traditional uses. The muña, a small aromatic herb that grows at altitude and that Aymara communities have used for stomach complaints and altitude sickness for centuries, contains compounds that explain its effectiveness. The understanding of altitude physiology that these communities have developed empirically, through generations of observation of how bodies respond to this environment and what helps, is in some ways ahead of the formal medical literature, which has been studying altitude physiology seriously for only a few decades. The curanderos and yatiris, the traditional healers who operate in Aymara communities, work with a cosmological framework that integrates physical, spiritual, and social dimensions of illness in a way that formal Western medicine treats as either superstition or, in a more charitable recent reading, as a holistic approach that addresses dimensions of well-being that biomedical models miss. In the borderland, the yatiri is available. The hospital is hours away. The choice of which framework to consult first is not ideological for most families. It is practical. And the outcomes, across the range of conditions that the Altiplano presents, are not as different as you might expect, partly because many conditions resolve on their own, partly because the traditional treatments work for the specific conditions they were developed to treat, and partly because the social and spiritual dimensions of the Yatiri's work, the reintegration of a sick person into the community, the ritual acknowledgement of what has gone wrong and what needs to change, address things that a tablet of antibiotics, even a necessary tablet of antibiotics, cannot address. This does not mean that the borderland is medically well served. It is not. There are things that people die from in this stretch that they would not die from if they had better access to formal health care. Children die from diarrheal diseases that are entirely preventable with clean water and oral rehydration therapy. Complications of pregnancy claim lives. Conditions that are manageable with medication become unmanageable without it. The state's absence from this stretch has consequences, and some of those consequences are deaths that do not need to happen. This is not something that can be romanticized or explained away. It is the cost of invisibility. The cost of being in a place that no government official has entered in 14 years. But the cost of visibility has historically been its own kind of cost in this region, and the communities of the borderland carry that history in their bodies and their memories as surely as they carry anything else. The Spanish colonial system that reorganized Andean society in the 16th and 17th centuries did so through a mechanism called the mita, a forced labor system that extracted tribute from indigenous communities in the form of labor, most notoriously in the silver mines of Potosí, where hundreds of thousands of Andean people died in conditions of extraordinary brutality in the service of the Spanish crown's silver extraction. The mita did not affect all areas equally, but it transformed the social structure of the Altiplano, disrupting communities and kinship systems and the land tenure arrangements that had organized Andean agriculture for centuries, and the disruption it caused has been reverberating in these communities ever since, shaping their relationship to state authority in ways that persist to the present. The Republican governments that followed independence in the 19th century, both Bolivia and Peru, did not fundamentally change the relationship between the state and the indigenous highland communities. The political class that took over from the Spanish was drawn from the same criollo elite that had administered the colonial system, and the legal structures of land ownership and labor that they inherited and modified continued to exclude indigenous communities from meaningful participation in the formal economy and the formal political system. The Great Bolivian Revolution of 1952 and its Peruvian counterparts of roughly the same era, brought land reform that nominally redistributed agricultural land to indigenous communities. But the implementation was incomplete, and the larger economic marginalization continued. The recognition of indigenous rights and identity that has become more significant in both countries in recent decades, culminating in Bolivia's Constitution of 2009 that declared the country a plurinational state and specifically recognized Aymara and Quechua and dozens of other indigenous identities as constitutive of the national identity, represents a shift in the legal framework. Whether it represents a shift in the lived reality of communities like those in the borderland is a more complicated question. What the history of state interaction with these communities has taught them, across the span of several centuries, is that the state comes to take things. It came to take labor. It came to take land. It came to take children in the form of compulsory education that has historically been an assimilationist project, a mechanism for replacing Aymara language and culture with Spanish language and national culture. It came to take fish in the form of fisheries regulations that criminalize traditional practices. It comes now, occasionally, in the form of tax authorities and police checkpoints and customs officials who take the goods that move across the border or who can be paid to look the other way, which is a different kind of taking. The 14 years without government officials entering this stretch is, from the perspective of many of its inhabitants, not a crisis. It is a respite. This is one of the most profound things to sit with when you are thinking about this borderland. The standard frame for discussing ungoverned territory is one of crisis, of absence, of the failure of the state to perform its function. And there are real costs to that absence, as we have already acknowledged. But there is another frame, one that the communities themselves are far more likely to use, which is that the absence of the state is not the absence of order, it is the presence of a different order, an order that these communities have maintained themselves, through their own institutions, their own dispute resolution mechanisms, their own collective management of shared resources, their own social norms and enforcement mechanisms, for centuries before the Bolivian and Peruvian states existed, and that continue to function in the state's absence. The communal governance structures of Aymara communities are ancient and pragmatic. The Ayalu, the basic unit of Andean social organization, is a kinship-based community that manages land and resources collectively, makes decisions through processes of consensus and rotating responsibility, and enforces community norms through a combination of social pressure and graduated sanctions that are far more finely calibrated to the actual texture of community life than anything a distant government could administer. The ALI system was disrupted by the colonial period and by the subsequent Republican land reforms. But it was not destroyed, and in many Altiplano communities, including those of the borderland, it continues to organize community life in ways that are not visible to the state, because the state is not present to see them. The collective management of the Totora reed beds is one example. The reed beds are shared resources, and their management requires collective agreement about who can harvest, how much, when, and in what manner. There are no government regulations governing the reed beds in the borderland because no government official has been there to impose them. But there are community rules, maintained through the institutions of the ILU, that manage the resource in a way that has preserved its productivity over long time periods. Not perfectly, because the pressures of population change and economic change are real, but sustainably enough that the reed beds are still there, still functioning, still providing what they have always provided, in communities where the state has been absent for a decade and a half. The fish of the lake are managed in a similar way. There are no fisheries officials patrolling the borderland stretch. There are no catch limits being enforced by anyone with a government badge. But there are community-level understandings about which areas of the lake are managed by which community, what kinds of gear are appropriate in what seasons, when certain fishing activities are suspended to allow fish populations to recover. These understandings are not written down in any document that would satisfy a regulatory agency. They live in the knowledge of the communities, enforced by the social mechanisms of communities that depend on the lake and know that the lake's health is the community's health. This is not to idealize the situation. Community-level resource management has its own pressures and failures. Individual defection from community rules happens. External economic pressures create incentives that community norms cannot always contain. The communities of the borderland are not perfectly functioning ecological utopias. They are communities of ordinary human beings trying to manage difficult situations with limited resources. But the point is that management is happening, in the absence of the state, through mechanisms that the state neither created nor sustains. The order that exists in this ungoverned stretch is not an absence of order. It is a different source of order. Let us talk about what happens at the edges of the 120-kilometer stretch, because the edges are instructive. At both ends of this stretch, the unmaintained borderland gives way to areas where the state has a more regular presence, where customs posts exist and police patrols happen, and the formal apparatus of border management is at least nominally in operation. And the communities that live at the transition points between the unattended stretch and the attended sections have developed what can only be described as expertise in managing the interface. They know which officials in which posts are willing to be paid and at what rate. They know which times of day the patrols happen, if they happen at all, and when the gaps are. They know which routes can be taken that avoid the checkpoints entirely without making the journey significantly longer. They know which goods trigger attention and